Willem, are you in deepest, darkest Africa right now? Coming to us
No,
via Elon Musk's Starlink.
no, unfortunately not. I'm on the other side. I'm on the Africa light side in South Africa at the moment, taking about a month and a half's leave before the busy season starts again. So trying to take a bit of rest while while there's still time.
Where's home in South Africa?
In Cape Town area.
Oh, awesome. That's awesome. Everyone says, have you been to Cape Town, Robbie? Because I'm South African, obviously. And I was like, you know what? I've only flown out of Cape Town in the last 3 years. When I was living in South Africa, I never got to Cape Town. I never went to Cape Town. I just did not experience that side of the world, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's very different to the rest of the country. Um, it's a very convenient city in that you've got the Table Mountain quite close to the city, so you can live a very nice lifestyle in that you're close to nature, but you're also close to work. So it's yeah, it's quite a nice area to be in. Very convenient, but um, also a lot of wind. So if you come, you need to bring a windbreaker with, or a yeah, we don't control the wind too much here.
So you're home for a month and a half. And who's looking after the lions right now?
So
Please
we've got
don't
a
tell me it's
team.
Mark.
No, no. Mark actually he just popped into camp. He had to go and fetch one of the helicopters. That's part of the flying operation within Mozambique. And uh, we have a small team of researchers in camp at the moment that are helping out with researching, with monitoring, basically keeping the ship going while I'm away. And yeah, it's really nice to have that the ability for one to take completely off, even though your head is still there. You're able to do a bit of R&R, which is quite important to keep the mind, uh, yeah, healthy, I guess, because during the year it does take quite a toll on you, just all the different things that need to be managed, things that need to be monitored. It just becomes a yeah, it becomes quite a intense. I don't really want to say a job because it doesn't feel like a job, but it becomes intense out there especially during the busy season. So fortunately, I've got a team that's busy monitoring the wildlife at the moment.
Willem Briers Louw, welcome to the Blood Origins podcast. We're super happy to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Willem, a lot of people are like, what's going on? Why is he not like, he lives in South Africa, he works in Mozambique, he's given a little bit of sort of interest in giving everyone just little heads up in like lions and monitoring and wildlife and whatnot. So do you want to describe what you do? It's probably, everyone aspires to this romantic job that you have, Willem. So what is it that you do?
All right, so just a bit of background on myself. So I studied a degree in conservation ecology at Stellenbosch University, which is based in the Cape in South Africa. And with this degree, I sort of came into this realization that wildlife conservation is where I want to work. It's a sort of passion that will keep me going until I'm 90 years old. Hopefully past that. And so started off with this degree, carried on into a master's degree, which led me into Malawi, where I spent 2 years doing research there, and in one of the parks that was also involved with lions, leopards, hyenas, and so on. And from there, came back, wrote up my master's, and then decided I wanted to test the dry side of the world, which is Namibia. So I was in Namibia for a couple of years doing research there, mostly in central Namibia. And after that, I decided I needed a new challenge, and so this position became available in Mozambique, which was mainly focused on monitoring and studying the lions in the landscape that were reintroduced as part of the project, which is called the 24 Lions Project, which is funded by the Kabela Family Foundation. And so I basically stepped into this role, a largely unknown role, in the sense that there wasn't much of a setup. It's not a well-known organization. It's a sort of grassroots level. And so coming in, it provided a lot of opportunities for me to have a bit of freedom and, see what needed to be done and then act on that without having too much red tape, which was an absolute blessing and really helped, I think, to get us where we are today. And so at the moment, it's really difficult to define the role because it's quite multifaceted in that so my main role is is managing the research and conservation for Zambeze Delta conservation. However, it also stems into helping anti-poaching with data collection and recording. It also goes into community support and trying to help out wherever I'm needed at depending on what Mark basically where he wants me. So it's I would say the main role is managing the research and the conservation within the Zambeze Delta, with the main focus being on the large carnivores, but subcategories under that, helping the anti-poaching with data collection, recording, and then also with the community.
Willem, what did you do your master's in?
So master's was actually pretty similar to the PhD, which I don't know if I should say stupidly decided to step into, but I say that because it's a lot. It's a master's degree on steroids. It takes a lot of your time and a lot of your free time, but quite essential, I think, for progressing in the industry and also for having a significant contribution, because essentially without spending all that time on a specific topic, they always say a PhD student knows so much about so little because they spend so much time focusing on very specific things. But because it's a landscape that needs the research, it's an easy, I don't want to say sacrifice because that sounds like it's a negative thing. It's an easy contribution, I guess, from my side. And so the master's I did in Malawi was very similar to what I'm doing now, in that it was basically monitoring the recovery or the reintroduction of large carnivores into a landscape. And so that was specifically for looking at leopards and lions that were introduced into Majeti Wildlife Reserve, which is in southern Malawi. And then from there, basically not replicating the same study in the Delta because it's very different, in that Majeti was a completely fenced reserve and only about 700 square kilometers, which is, I'm not going to convert that to acres because I'll make a fool out of myself. But that's about 70,000 hectares. So, whereas the Zambeze Delta is approximately in total in size is just under 1 million hectares, which I think is about 2.5 million acres. So it's sort of a project, the MSc on steroids again. So, yeah.
Well, that's what a PhD is supposed to be, man. I have a lot of people don't, and I don't flaunt it around, but I have a PhD, and you're absolutely right. You know a lot about something that is very, very, very minute. And when you start dealing with your PhD committee, it's like herding cats at the end of the day. And everyone knows how difficult it would be to move one cat versus herding a bunch of cats, which is what your PhD committee ends up being like. And yeah, the reason I wanted to talk to you is obviously there's a great history, there's a great story being woven in the Zambeze Delta with Mark and you guys and what you're doing, and the Kabela Family Foundation and the 24 Lions Project that's soon to be the 100 Lions Project, and we can get into that here soon. But more selfishly, again, so you get to know me a little bit more, I have a PhD, I'm a wetland ecologist, I'm a swamp guy. And I've been fascinated by wetlands since I was 16 years old. When I went to the Okavango swamps when I was 16, I just fell in love with it and walked right into Wits University and talk to a professor and say, what do I need to study wetlands? What courses do I need to take? And just like you did a conservation biology degree. I did an environmental conservation biology degree at the University of Witwatersrand. And in when I was a professor at Mississippi State, I taught a class called Wetland Ecology and Management. And I used case studies from all around the world. And one of the case studies, it was on wetland systems. And one of the case studies, which is one of the ones that I've never seen, but I want to see it badly, is the Maromeo, which is this 500,000 acre wetland swamp complex at the delta of the Zambeze River, where it enters into the Indian Ocean. And you're living in a place that sort of tickles my sort of research fancy, from a wetlands perspective. But you're certainly in the wildlife game there. Willem, let me ask this question, because it's a pertinent question to what's happening with where you're working and whatnot, and how you were raised, and how you studied. Because I remember studying at Wits and doing environmental conservation biology. I went to Kruger. We did a bunch of work in Kruger. There really was no weaving of sustainable consumptive use into the conservation research world that you lived in. What did you, before you went and worked for Mark, coming out of Stellenbosch, what was your thoughts around hunting and consumptive use and its role in conservation?
So I was fortunate enough to not grow up on a farm, but to be associated with family that own farmland within South Africa. And that allowed me at quite an early age to see, understand, and experience that side of conservation, which is something that the majority of the general public doesn't know, just because they've never experienced it before. And so growing up, we basically went to my uncle's farm in Eastern Cape of South Africa, and it was hunting largely for supplies for the rest of the year. It was basically doing it from bottom up, so going out, doing the hard yards, looking for the animals. When you find them, it's an appreciation of the landscape, it's an appreciation of the animals. Once the animals are harvested for the pot, essentially, that whole process is done by us with because you hands deep in the stuff. You actually understand why it's important, and you understand. And over time, I was able to understand the management component of it. In that, if there is use that is sustainable of wildlife, it can actually benefit conservation on a large scale. And so growing up, I'm fortunate enough to have experienced that, because I'm always, my sort of philosophy is, you can't really talk about something if you don't fully understand it, if you haven't tried to understand it. And so growing up, it was the ability to experience it, learn from it, and then try and see where it fits into the bigger picture. And so I think this is actually one thing that's lacking in the world today, in that anything that's associated with hunting or sustainable use, for whatever reason, there's always it's a touchy subject, and people don't want to get stuck into it. But it's such an important
Well, I would think even in the world that you live in, right? The world that you circle in, because it's a very unique world that you circle in now, right? You're in the research monitoring game of wildlife, which typically, you're not specifically working with rhinos, but it's people that are dehorning rhinos, collaring rhinos, doing a lot of collaring work, a lot of monitoring work, a lot of following work, big carnivore work, lions, leopards, wild dogs, rhinos, elephants. Honestly, Willem, you tell me, from me looking from the outside in, that world is very much there's people like you that understand consumptive use, but for the vast majority, there's almost a stigma in that world that's like, hunting isn't good.
No, exactly. And I mean, being a researcher, my a lot of my work, a lot of my reading is in the scientific literature, and even from that perspective, there's this inherent bias against sustainable use because people want to go to a national park and they want to see the animal, but because they don't understand that there's different parts of conservation. There's not only one specific conservation type that suits your needs or your philosophy. I think that's where the sort of line is between people that are practical in the sense of they know the different aspects. They know that this particular one works in this situation when, for example, in the Zambeze Delta, where it's highly inaccessible. It's wet during in the rainy season. The roads become inaccessible for 6 months of the year. So you pretty much have a window of 6 months to do any sort of tourism, photo tourism, if that was the alternative. And then on top of that, there's horribles of mosquitoes, horribles of tsetse flies. It's difficult to it's a low how can I put this? The footprint is quite low in that there's aircons is a complete luxury. It's not seen as a want, or it's not seen as an essential. It's a luxury in one sort of situation, and so I think people that think that ecotourism can take the place of hunting in certain areas, it's not quite the case. And so understanding that there's different sides to it, and in certain situations there are certain things that are more applicable in certain landscapes. I think with that in mind, it's sort of where we will progress, because this, as I was trying to say earlier, the scientific literature is very much opposed to, especially the trophy hunting thing. There's this inherent, I don't want to say the scientific literature is against it, but there's an inherent sort of undertone of we need to make sure that all the areas are converted to national parks and to wildlife reserves. But the reality is that it's not possible. And where hunting or sustainable use is done sustainably, it can actually work. And I think the Delta is a really good example of how it can work. I mean, it's certainly not perfect. I don't think any model is perfect, but it works, and it provides us a safe space for wildlife to move, and it provides us the opportunity to restore the wildlife. Which, I mean, considering that Mozambique was a post-war landscape or post-war country, having the ability to use this model of sustainable use and show that how it's contributing to community development on the outside and on the inside. It's contributing to wildlife population growth. It's contributed to reintroductions, bringing species back into areas where they were previously extirpated from. It's all pretty significant stuff, and I think understanding that and also highlighting that on the broader spectrum is important. And so, just coming back to what I do is what we're trying to achieve is to share this story, but not just not just on social media, because that's a portion of it, but also in the scientific literature where there's evidence to show that this model works, and we need to try and promote this, not because we think it's better than national parks, but there is definitely a role for it in conservation.
Willem, let's use this opportunity then you're a researcher on the ground in the Zambeze Delta. You work for a hunting operator. Can you give us some examples of what you have seen using from a science perspective, from a data gathering perspective, from a monitoring perspective? Can you tell us what has changed over time? You know, the adage here is that we constantly use is, hunting in these areas, in these big concessions, that this is, you guys are in one of the concessions in Mozambique, that is actually aiding wildlife. It's helping wildlife by, putting anti-poaching in place, protecting habitats, providing community benefits. But the the proof is in the pudding. So what is the proof, Willem, that you've seen from a research perspective in the Zambeze Delta from a wildlife perspective?
That's actually, I was thinking about that. I was like, oh, this is going to be a tough one, but actually it's pretty easy. So just in terms of wildlife, unfortunately, a lot of this work was done by people before me. So it's nice to be able to present the work, even though it wasn't my work to begin with, but I guess I am part of the system. But so just to give a bit of background to Mozambique and the landscape. So between the 1960s and 1990s, there was about two and a half decades of war, which took place, and it created this I want to say, I guess like a hole in the country, in that there was a lot of vacant land because all the people fled. But then at the same time, there was a lot of encroachment of people into the protected areas, sort of in response to the fear of the conflict. And so what ended up happening was wildlife populations within the Zambeze Delta specifically, but also in the surrounding areas, were depleted. And when I say depleted, it's it's a significant depletion. So, for example, before the war, there was an estimated 45,000 African buffalo in the Zambeze Delta landscape, which is it's a few. And essentially what happened was there was about a 95% depletion of all the wildlife within the landscape. So buffalo going from 45,000 to about 1 to 2,000 individuals. And because they were the most abundant at the time, all the other prey populations, so waterbuck, common reedbuck, zebra, all of these species declined even below thousands. They were at most 100 or maybe 200. And so with this, Mark Haldane entered the frame, and he observed the landscape. He saw that the habitat was still intact. There were people living inside the concession. Virtually no wildlife. So the wildlife sort of was at its minimum, at the lowest of low. And he came in, and for some reason he said this is going to work. And so he introduced the hunting conservation model. With the introduction of foreign clientele, he managed to raise funds to support an anti-poaching team, which was quite small at that stage. But even a little bit of impact of control in that sort of a landscape, which is completely unfenced. There's nothing restricting animals from moving in and out of the landscape. With a little bit of protection, it had started to have a major impact on catching illegal poachers, explaining to the local people that no, this is not allowed. You're not allowed to come into the area. You're not allowed to poach. And then acting on that as well with a lot of arrests, snare removals, gin truck removals. And so over time, that anti-poaching team managed to progress or advance, in the sense that the landscape became, after the war, there was I think a period where Mark was able to capitalize on the people that were actually sort of the diehards, and that would put up with, this is proper Africa, coming to this landscape. And with the clientele following on of that was obviously a word of mouth sort of story, where people said, this is an amazing place, you need to go and visit this, something incredible is happening here. And over time, more funding came in from these clients, which resulted in improving the anti-poaching units, putting them on motorbikes that they're able to access different areas. And with that came increased control and protection across the landscape. And what followed was prey recovery. And so the prey has started to recover. Most populations have increased to over half of their pre-war numbers, with buffalo currently at about 25,000, which is not too bad when you think that they came down to about 1,000 or 2,000 individuals. So, and that's sort of the buffalo is sort of the proxy we use for the prey counts, because they're the most visible, easily counted species. And given that most of the surveys are done with aerial transects, it can miss a lot of the smaller stuff, which probably increased even more so than the buffalo, but just difficult to count. So we've in this sort of period where the wildlife numbers are continually increasing, and it got to a point where lions were basically extirpated from the landscape, and a decision was then made to introduce them or reintroduce them. And this is the birth of the 24 Lions Project, and this is where I guess the journey started for the. So technically, the conservation started already back when Mark came into the landscape, but the research and active monitoring started sort of with the introduction of the lions. That was the catalyst in the situation. So that's
Willem, and you're monitoring lions. What else are you monitoring? You're monitoring lions. I know that you're monitoring leopards, elephants. What's the sort of gamut of things that you're monitoring? Obviously, you've got your big survey transects every year. You're not just spouting numbers. These numbers come from, again, very rigorous, very expensive helicopter surveys of the landscape too, right?
Yes, no, exactly. So the research, people always ask me, so what are you doing the monitoring on? I just say anything that lives and breathes. It's an easy answer. People either they turn away or they're actually interested. So, but basically, as I mentioned earlier, the main focus is the lions because there's specific funding for the Lion Project, which we try and monitor as best as possible using observations. So with a lot of the lions that were introduced were collared with GPS collars, and that allows us to track them readily in the field. We're fortunate enough to have access to helicopters for monitoring, specifically for lions at this stage, lions and cheetahs, which I'll get to shortly. And so when it's wet season, it's wet season. and you were speaking earlier about the wetland ecology and your past your past research and PhD. I think it's definitely worth you popping in to see the landscape, because you definitely want to see it when it's dry, because when it's wet, it's you're sort of stuck in camp and there's not much you can do because the roads are all soaked in with rain. So we do rely largely on helicopter monitoring in the wet season. And in the dry season, there's sort of almost a 50-50 split in the year, where sort of from June, July, you're able to drive out, access the landscape a lot more. That's when we start to monitor the lions by vehicle. We use remote camera traps to monitor pretty much anything that walks past them. But the idea is to try and estimate population numbers for the more elusive species like leopard and spotted hyena. Also things like serval, smaller cats, civets as well. Interestingly, we found a few records from the camera traps of African palm civet, which hasn't actually been recorded in the landscape in our region before. So that was quite a cool find. So other than that, I mean, we're basically using camera traps on a large scale to monitor the species that are uniquely identifiable are individually identifiable. So, for example, leopards with their pattern, the spot, the left and right flanks that are unique to each individual. Same with hyenas, same with civets and servals as well. So cameras form a huge part of monitoring those species that we don't always have collars on. It gives us a good idea of population trends over time. So we're trying to look at annual trends to then inform management on how do we best manage these species. And then on top of that, we actually, something that we've sort of I've neglected just because of time, and we have just only recently grown our team. It was a one-man band at some point, and so there was a lot of field work that was for one person, but now we've increased slightly, which allows us to look at monitoring additional things which benefit management. And so one of those is prey-based monitoring. So with using ground transects. So we're actually starting that this year, which we're quite excited about. And that just provides an sort of alternative or complementary survey analysis to the aerial counts, which, as we both know, are pretty good and accurate for the large group living species that like to be in the open. But when you're dealing with nyala and bushbuck in the more forested woodland landscapes, it's really tricky to get an understanding from them from aerial surveys. So ground-based surveys are where we're trying to fill that gap. And then, yeah, I mean, as I said, anything that lives, moves, and breathes, at this stage, we're trying to wrap our heads around the understanding of distributions of the different animals, why they're living in certain areas, different habitats, the interactions between the species. So understanding whether the carnivores are competing in certain areas, whether it's in space use or time, or just behaviorally, to see if there's anything we can help again to inform management with. And so I think just coming back to the research element, if there's not anything we can contribute that can help either science or management, like there's no purpose in, well, this is my philosophy, so don't quote me on this, but if there's nothing that's of use of the research that you're doing, why are you doing it? And so I sort of have this philosophy in mind. If why rather use your time to work on projects that are actually going to benefit the landscape or contribute to science. And so that's sort of where we are at this stage and where we're trying to progress.
Yeah, it's the research that you're doing. There's a side of science that it does research for research, and that's good, and that's increasing our understanding constantly. But there's a side of science that typically lives in the sort of resource lane, which is we're doing science and research for management, for understanding the ecosystem better, so that we can, being the stewards of the landscape, we can inform our decision making, inform our management as a result of science to make sure that we are creating the best ecosystem possible that is influenced by humans.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've brought cheetahs onto the landscape as well, and here's another important point I think to say is that you've got both lions and cheetahs now, which that's an interesting research topic in itself because there's interactions there. Lions are notorious for killing cheetahs. You've put on this whole investment into lions, grown that lion population. You're now putting cheetahs into the landscape, and their population's growing. And so there's a phenomenal sort of natural experiment happening in front of your eyes in terms of these two predators interacting with each other, and you have the collaring data to show their interactions. But most importantly, neither of those predators are actually hunted.
Yeah, so in 2021, we brought in the first 11 cheetahs into the landscape. So cheetahs have been reintroduced mostly within fenced reserves largely in South Africa, but also in a few other reserves or national parks across Africa. But they've all been within fenced reserves, which for cheetahs is quite important because they do roam quite widely. And this is probably, or if not probably one of the first reintroductions into an unfenced landscape, which introduces a very unknown variable into the mix, because cheetahs that are introduced into fenced landscapes generally do extremely well, easy, quick to breed, survival rates are high. Yes, they lose quite a lot of their young to lions being the dominant predator, but most of the projects where there's either only cheetahs or where there's low densities of competing carnivores, the cheetahs do really well. And so trying this into an unfenced landscape is always going to be a challenge. And so we decided to, after consultation and feasibility analyses, we decided to bring cheetahs into the landscape, again funded by the Cabela Family Foundation. And a lot of that was a lot of our efforts were trying to make sure that they get past the different stages of the reintroduction, which, you sort of release them, you want to monitor them until they start to establish, then they get to breeding, then they get to population growth. And so the stories are similar in terms of the cheetahs and the lions, but they do vary slightly in that with the lions, we brought them in, we decided to put the bomas where the highest prey density was. They were released, all the lions stuck around. The odd one did a bit of a roam around and tried to explore the landscape, but 80-90% of them stayed put, which is what you want. You want that stability quite early on. And once they settle, they start breeding, and then it's uphill from there. Well, it's not uphill, but it's positive from then on. The cheetahs, on the other hand, they took quite a while to establish. There was a lot of roaming from all the individuals from release. There were a few things that we probably would do differently if we had to do it again, just in terms of boma placement and that sort of stuff, and maybe time of year of release, that sort of stuff. But you would still expect them to stay where there's most food. But what happened was a lot of them left the areas where there was a lot of food. And so what we've sort of learned over time is that it's not necessarily the food that's the anchor, but it's more the social communication amongst the cheetah population, or the intraspecific communication. So what that is basically scent marking sites, which are in a normal landscape. You will have these trees or termite mounds or anything that's fairly prominent. You'll have the cheetahs scent marking those places, and it acts like these communication hubs. So it's sort of like going to the local bar, where you don't necessarily go for a drink, but you go for a sniff and smelling who's in your place, who's in your area. And so what we've learned is that this is actually seems to be more important than prey availability, at least in terms of anchoring them in an unfenced landscape. As I said, this is what we know to date. There's no science to back it up, but this is what we can say anecdotally. And so from this, there's an increased understanding of how do we actually reintroduce them into these landscapes, into these unfenced areas. And so the population, there's been breeding events, there's been cubs produced, there's been both anthropogenic and natural mortalities, of which I think natural might be a little bit higher at this stage. But the one thing is that a lion is a tough bugger. It can survive quite a lot, in the sense that if it gets injured, it can recover for the most part, unless it's a really, really bad injury. But for the most part, they can recover. A cheetah is a lot softer is not the right word. They are a lot
sensitive. It's a more sensitive animal.
Yeah, exactly. So their whole morphology is built for speed, needs to run, and you think of a runner that pulls a hammy or something, like he's not going to be able to sprint again, like, for a while. And so cheetahs that get injured, sometimes they don't recover, and this is something where you sort of a lion you can let go. They can recover by themselves for the most part, even following snaring events, which we've seen can be pretty hectic. But coming back to the sort of where we are at this stage of the cheetah population and the interactions is, firstly, the population hasn't grown yet. We're still waiting for that. We're sort of on the verge of that transition. There has been breeding events. They are reproducing. There are cubs. Survival of the cubs is quite low, but this is quite common for the species across the board. So we're not too concerned about that, but we would like to see survival picking up. And then in terms of the interactions between the lions and the cheetahs, so what's quite interesting is a lot of the cheetahs were initially sort of did a little bit of a loop into the forested landscape, but in the delta there's this almost semi-hard boundary between forest or woodland and then floodplain. And the floodplain is where all the cheetahs are now pretty much resident. They move up and down there. They move past the lions. They greet each other at about 100 meters away from what we can see from the collar data. And so there's a lot of movement within. There's a lot of overlap of movement and home ranges. We run monthly reports where we can actually see. We visually see this, and it's quite interesting to see. But to date, we haven't recorded any losses as a result of lines. Although there could have been, some of the natural mortalities are difficult to monitor because sometimes you only pick, say for example, the collar fails and you aren't able to pick up any signal for a while. It can take 3-4 days, and by that stage the body can be decomposed already. So it's difficult to say it was or it wasn't lines, but for the most part it seems to be other natural causes. So if you can't, we don't know, but not lines. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's certainly a unique experiment that I don't think is happening anywhere else right now. Yeah, and I think you look at your Instagram page and you see all this. You almost see the glamorous romantic side of what you do. Lion researcher, collaring lions, flying around in helicopters, and everyone's listening to this podcast going, "Oh my God, Willem has the best job in the world," and you probably do. But there's a lot of people don't understand from a research and monitoring perspective. You are working to the bone, and for all of the hours that are romantic in the air with a helicopter and tracking lions, there's the 5 times less than romantic hours sitting in front of a computer crunching data and putting data into spreadsheets, right?
Yeah. So I think there's a line that gets drawn in the sand as to what is the lifestyle that you choose. And so there's an option to have the more stable sort of family life where you in a more convenient landscape or area, and on the other spectrum you have people that choose to dedicate themselves to a project or to a specific line of work which requires a lot of time and effort. But they also say that if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. And so that's sort of where my philosophy is at this stage. Is I really enjoy the work that I do. Yes, we spend a lot of time out there. Normally it's about 10 months of the year. So for 2 months, here and there, we try and come back and have a dose of civilization and just try and sort out whatever admin things need to be sorted out, and then run back to the bush when we get tired of driving in traffic or sick of it. And so it is a fairly romanticized job in that a lot of times people ask me, I love what you do, I wish I could do it. And yes, it is nice, and yes, there's a lot of cool things that happen, but there's also a lot of sacrifices. And this is where that side of it is not always advertised. And I think social media can be quite a spinner of the truth in a way, in that, it's always the positive things are always posted for the most part. And so I think explaining to people as well that it's not all sunshine and roses, that, these difficult days, we can have a day out in the bush where you think, my goodness, why am I even doing this? Where, for example, you lose a lion to a snare or something, something that's sort of out of your control, but you think human pressures and community aren't wanting to work with the whole setup, and there's a bit of conflict here and there, and then on the other, like, you can literally have one day where you're feeling so down, and then the very next day you can find lions with new cubs, or you can see baby elephants walking around, or whatever the case is. You have this high and low. There's at such great spectrums, but the highs are so high that it keeps you so engaged, and you're wanting to stay in that space. And we often talk about being in a bubble, because out there you stay in this place. There's not much of a social community around where we are. So you kind of in this camp, you are meeting people left, right, and center. There's people coming in, but it's quite isolated, and there's not like a easy getaway. And so the time that we break from the bubbles when we come back home on holiday or on leave. But even then, it's often difficult to adapt because now you've spent 10 months in the bush. You come back to the city or to wherever your origins are, and you try and explain to people what you do. And you can see most of the people sort of like, oh, that's very nice, but you can see it just goes straight over the top of the head, just because they don't understand, and it is difficult to try and explain it where you're like so invested in this place and in the projects and the success of it that sometimes you sort of sacrifice a bit of the, I don't want to say reality because it's not quite that, but you sacrifice something, whatever that might be. It's not just a one-sided affair. There's a bit of give and take on that.
Yeah, look, it's you live and work in an amazing landscape, but it is wild and it has its ups and downs, and it has pressures around it for wildlife. And Mark and what Zambeze Delta Conservation has done is remarkable, but it only comes with people like you helping him do the work and get the data and really push forward from a research perspective this idea of sustainable management of wildlife. Unfortunately, you have to work with a guy called Adam Bender, but if he gives you any trouble, just holler at me, okay?
I will do. I'm sure it's definitely no trouble. He visited us in, I think it was 2019, I think it was, and he had a group with him that they did some elephant collaring to help us monitor the elephants in the landscape and see where they move, where they're causing conflict and all this sort of stuff. So, he popped in there. It was awesome to meet him, and he's probably going to pop in at some point again soon, given his new role. Very exciting stuff.
I wouldn't be too excited. I don't want to give him a big head, But Willem, you're the man. I appreciate you. I appreciate the opportunity to get you on here and chat a little bit about what you do and whatnot. If people want to find you on Instagram, they can look you up at let me have a look at Willem D_BL is your Instagram handle. Is there any stuff out there that people can find about Zambeze Delta and the research that you're doing?
So there's also Zambeze Delta Conservation Instagram page, as well as a Facebook page for Zambeze Delta Conservation. So those two are the main platforms that we post a lot of the ongoing daily, day-to-day stuff. New cubs being born, anti-poaching making good progress on their front, a lot of the community support and engagement projects that are ongoing. All of that stuff gets posted on there. So for people that are inclined to the social media, that's probably the best platforms to access that information from. Otherwise, we're trying to set up a new website, so that will hopefully pop up relatively soon, but I don't have the details for that at this stage. And then otherwise, I guess just there's a few research papers coming out relatively soon on some of the research that we're doing in the Delta. So for anyone who's interested in that.
I would highly encourage people to check out your Instagram page, Willem D_BL. Obviously, a wonderful wildlife photographer, because you do that on the side as a little hobby. But you got some really cool videos, obviously the stuff that you do, and I think the video that I love the most, obviously you got a bunch of different videos, you got cubs from the air and whatnot, but I really love your buddy who's helping you with elephant collaring, coming up and tapping an elephant on its butt, and it literally just falls over, as you say, the elephant whisperer. But it does have a dart in its butt, and it's about to fall over. So it was perfect timing. It was amazing.
Yeah.
Well, dude, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Holler if you need anything from me, okay?
Great, thanks a lot, and you're welcome anytime in the Delta.
Oh, for sure. I'm going to be there.